It's a privilege and a simcha to be together with you. We would all much prefer if we would be able to actually be together. But we are still in the midst of this terrible pandemic, and that is impossible. But we are together in many ways. And before actually speaking about the Divrei Torah I want to share with you, I just want to thank a few outstanding individuals that made this possible. My dear friend, Rabbi Sachs, the Rosh Hashiva, describes himself as my Talmud. There is no greater covet to me that such a great teacher of Torah is, in a way, the way he sees it, my Talmud, the way I see it, a very dear friend. He was the one that suggested this to me in the first place, and I think he was. If not for Rabbi Sachs, this wouldn't have happened. My dear friend, Rabbi Krupka, such an outstanding individual, a pillar of Torah, of Chesed. We've known each other before, but since I was offered this reward, we got to know each other better, and it's a privilege and a simcha. The president of Turo, Dr. Alan Kadish, what an outstanding person and personality, a real Talmid Chochem, a Ben Torah, an academic, a scientist, personifying the shiluv of Torah and Mada. Rabbi Daniel Lander, the Rosh Hashiva of Orach Chaim, and the son of the founder of the Turo Initiative, Turo College. Dr. Levine today happens to be his yortzeit. And let the Torah we share today be Le'ilui Nishmosoi. Mr. Joel Margolis, the founder of the Endowment Fund, and it's a schus and a covet for me to be the very first recipient. I hope the others will be greater than I am, and I thank him for his generosity. Le'ilui Nishama, and in the memory of Reb Rafal Zalman Levine. As Dr. Kadish mentioned, obviously, Harav Levine was an outstanding personality. A musmach of probably the two greatest gedolim in Lithuania, Reb Chaim Briska and Reb Chaim Moise Grodzinski. Those were the two giants, pillars of light, probably outstanding amongst all the other giants of that very special generation. He was a Talmud of Reb Baruch Ber in Kamenetz, and he came to America and refused to be a Klei Kodesh. It actually reminds me of my late father, who was a great Talmid Chochem. In the East Side, where we lived when I was a child, we were neighbors of Reb Moshe Feinstein, the giant of our generation, of our times, not exactly our generation. And I have unbelievable memories from Reb Moshe. And Reb Moshe tried to persuade and coax and convince my father to go into Rabbanos, but he was not successful. So my father was a businessman, a contractor, but he was a huge Talmid Chochem. And when I read the biography, the story of Rabbi Rafal Zalman Levine, it reminds me of my father. And my last acknowledgement is the Turo Network, 5 medical schools, thousands of medical students, and many more in various different programs. And I think it's a Kiddush Hashem. So I thank you for sharing this with me and for supporting the publication of Minchas Asher on COVID-19. I think it's going to be an amazing sefer. And it was made possible by the endowment, by the gift, by the reward of Mr. Joe Margolis and Torah College. So the Sefer will have 160 tshuvas, about 650 pages, dealing with many dilemmas and questions in many different areas. Dalet Chelke Shulchan Aruch and Orach Chaim and Yoredei and Even Ezer Choshen Mishpat, brought about by this pandemic. Questions we could say, Lo Shorum Avoiseinu, just couldn't be imagined before this pandemic broke out. And about 30 letters and shmusin and talks and divrei chizuk. So thank you. So a few months ago, I gave one shiur, but today I know that I am especially addressing the medical students. Some time ago, a person asked me, is it true that the Rav Paskind, referring to me, that if you're not going to teach Torah, you should be a doctor? I smiled to myself and responded, no, I never paskin that you need to be either a Rosh Yeshiva or a doctor. That cannot be a psak by its very nature, but it could be a recommendation, and I definitely recommend, if you could dedicate your life to Torah, to teach Torah, to learn Torah, that is number one priority. But if that is not within your reach and your ability, I definitely would recommend choosing medicine. Rabbanim and doctors have something in common. They are the shepherds of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Falak, and they dedicate their lives, they should dedicate their lives to helping others, salvage others, to heal their body and soul, their guf and neshama. One of the special tshuvas in the new Sefer, it should be out in about 2 weeks, Minchas Osher on COVID-19. It's Siman Yud Beis. So with the outbreak of this pandemic, a person turned to me, there's an urgent need to buy ventilators and to supply medicines to so many Jewish patients. And I was asked to help. Should I take funds that every year, in normal circumstances, I would give to yeshivas and divert them to medicine, to buy ventilators, instead of supporting a yeshiva or a kollel to help put up what would be defined as a field hospital, buying medicine and ventilators. And usually my tshuvas are always based on early sources. So let me first give you a brief summary of Gedolei Yisrael that were involved in establishing and putting up hospitals. Most famous, Rebbe Akiva Eiger, Tov Kuf Tzadik Beis. We don't find this in Tshuvas Rebbe Akiva Eiger, but we do find it in the Igros, in his letters. And the story was one of the wealthy members of the Kehillah in Posen was Reb Zalman Binyamin Latitz. And when he was old and ill, and Rebbe Akiva Eiger came to visit him, he asked Rebbe Akiva Eiger, I plan to put aside substantial monies for a Dvar Mitzvah after my demise. What do you suggest I do? And Rebbe Akiva Eiger suggested 50% to establish a Beis Medrash and a Beis Talmud, and 50% for a hospital. And that was Tov Kuf Tzadik Beis. In Tov Kuf Tzadik Aleph, we find many takonos and letters from Rebbe Akiva Eiger dealing with a cholera epidemic. Not a pandemic, which is global, but an epidemic, which is more localized. And to me, it is clear that the Beki Vegas initiative, building a Jewish hospital, was associated with the cholera outbreak. Tov Reish Nun Bey, 60 years later, we find from Jews in Tveria establishing a hospital to care for the local community. The two Rabbeim of Galicia, the Shinnevarov, Reb Cheskala, the son of the great Divrei Chaim of the Tzanzarov, and Reb Yoshua, the Belzerov, Reb Shiela Belzer, wrote a letter. I think it's the only letter signed by the Shinnevarov and the Belzerov in German. So the letter is written in German, and it has two great signatories, turning to the communities in Germany, in Central Europe, to support a hospital in Tveria. I have the schus of being a Talmud, a disciple of the great Kloisenberger Rebbe, the Rebbe of Tzanz Kloisenberg, the Divrei Yatzev, who was truly a giant in Torah, in Avodah, in Chesed, a giant in so many ways. And he spent so much time and energy. It just cannot be described. And it cannot be overestimated in establishing the Laniado Hospital in Netanya. The Maharsham, the greatest posek in Galicia in his day and age, his tzavoah was printed in the introduction to the Sefer Tcheles Mordechai, ala Torah. And following the recommendation of Rebbe Kiva Eger, he set aside money for worthy causes, 50% for a Beis Medrash and 50% for a hospital. Almost 200 years ago, we find a controversy. Shalas Teshuvos Chayim La'olam, Yoredei Simen Chof Aleph. That was one of the great poskim, Sephardi poskim of the time, Reb Nissim Chaim Mudai. And he writes, I remember when I was a youngster in Magenza, a person was found dead in the woods. So in days of yore, the city would bring an Egla Arufa. And the community decided, following that tragedy, to establish a hospital. Years have passed. And the Rav of the community decided, we don't have housing for our Talmidim. And he decided to close the hospital and use the building for a local yeshiva. The donors, the board of directors of the hospital were taken aback, and they were adamant to keep the hospital going, and they disagreed. And the question was sent to the Adgon, Reb Nissim Chaim Mudai, and we find it in his Tshuvas Chaim Li'olam. He sides with the Balabatim, and he says, you cannot close the hospital, and you will need to find a different solution for the yeshiva. So Baruch Hashem, we don't have these questions today. Baruch Hashem, we have yeshivas, we have hospitals. But I just mean to stress the importance of, yes, Rabbonim and doctors, yeshivas and koilalim and hospitals. And I think Torah College is an exemplar. It is a symbol of the combination of Torah and Mada, the shiluv, the chibur between Torah and science. Once a day, we define HaKadosh Baruch Hu as Noisein HaTorah, when we say Birchas HaTorah every morning. 100 times a day, we define HaKadosh Baruch Hu as Melech HaOlam. And in each and every one of those mea brachas, it is Borachatu Hashem Elokeinu, Melech Olam. Kodesh Baruch Hu gave us Torah. Kodesh Baruch Hu created the world. And Kodesh Baruch Hu is the one that put into place, yes, the laws of nature. Physics, biology, medicine. And it is incumbent upon us, it is our duty, first and foremost, to teach Torah, but also to care for the medical and physical needs of our communities. So that is why I think it is so important to train from young medical professionals, b'derech haTorah. And I want to bless your endeavors of bringing these two most lofty ideals together. So one of the questions presented to me, and I was asked to address this question, in a time of a pandemic, when obviously medical professionals are putting their lives in a certain degree of danger, would I still recommend to young people to go into medicine? So this is a huge discussion, which I wrote many tshuvas about. Primarily, Shalos Tshuvas Minchas Asher, I think it's Chelek Gimel Siman Kuf Chof Aleph, but I also think in Chelek Aleph. To what degree is one expected to put his life in jeopardy to save another person whose life is in far greater danger? And Mara Mokoim Anilacha, I can't go into the discussion with all its sources, but the conclusion of my tshuvas is, if the danger to which one exposes himself is extremely remote and minimal, and he is salvaging a person from a far greater immediate and imminent and great danger, based on tshuvas haradbaz, it definitely is a midas chasidus. Koroiv lechiyuv. But one of the novel ideas which I expressed, and I feel this very strongly, even if it's not a chiyuv to endanger yourself to save another person, but every decent society and a Torah society as well will expect some of its members to volunteer and to put their lives in a somewhat higher level of danger to address the needs of the broader community. What do I mean? So every decent society expects volunteers, and there are volunteers, to address the needs of society and to volunteer to duties that are somewhat more dangerous than others. And I'm not speaking about military service. Military service is a criteria of its own, and many Gedolei Yisrael say that not only a Melchemes Mitzvah, even Melchemes Reshus overrides Pikuach Nefesh, because in civil life, Chayechu koidmen lachayei chavecho. But in military ethos, chayei chavecho koidmen lachayecho. Yes, soldiers are expected to put their life in danger to save their families, their communities, the civilian population. But I'm not talking about military service. Cops, policemen, firefighters, rescue divers. When these people do their jobs, they definitely expose themselves to a greater level of danger than clerks, bankers, koilel jungalite. So when I was growing up in America, it was Harlem or the South Bronx. Recently, I think Baltimore had the highest rate of homicide, so I'm not really up to date. But yes, cops do patrol the streets in some unpleasant and unfriendly communities. And we expect them to do so. Firefighters put their lives in danger, and some of them pay the ultimate price. Rescue divers jump out of helicopters into stormy waters to save people that are shipwrecked. And in many other professions, we all remember 9/11, when hundreds of firefighters went into those buildings trying to save. So in a few years, probably the film community will have a prime minister in Israel. I think it'll take some more time till the president of the United States will be a firm Jew, if ever. So when our country will abide to every detail in halacha, will we abolish the Coast Guard? Will there be no more rescue divers or firefighters? If the NYPD would consult me on 9/11, would I say, nobody should enter the building, you're putting your life in danger? No. I think Al Pi Halacha we would say the same. Yes, we expect you more than others. Don't commit suicide. At some stage, they were told you could no longer enter the building, but yes, we do expect some of us to volunteer and to put their lives in a somewhat higher level of danger than we expect of others. Do I have any source in halacha? Of course I do, because whatever I say is based on sources in halacha. I think a Rav could paskin not only from his feelings, which are important, which are valid. So in Choshe Mishpat Siman Yud Beis, we learn the halacha of lo saguru b'fnei ish, a dayan, a shofet, a rabbinical judge, could not be afraid. And the Sefri, quoted in the Rambam, Sefer HaMitzvos, and in Hilchos Dayanim as well, in Hilchos Sanhedrin, that a dayan cannot say, I am afraid the defendant or the claimant might kill one of my family members. No. Lo saguru mipnei ish. What type of people are we dealing with? What type of Balei Adin? More than 20 years that I have Bezen in Yerushalayim. I never was afraid that one of the Balei Adin might try to destroy my family or kill, chas v'sholom, one of my family members. If you have Rabbi Sol Salanter as a claimant and Rabbi Zusha Mahanepali as a defendant, you have no reason to be afraid they might hurt one of your family members. Obviously, we're dealing with Inshe de lo Mali, with violent, bad people. So does a dayan need to put his life on the line and put his family members in jeopardy? This is a very powerful question. So the Beis Yosef quotes Tshuvas HaRashba. Chelik Beisim in Shin Daled Mem, instead of Shin Mem Daled, Shin Daled Mem. The Rashba explains, well, most times when a person threats, it's just an empty threat. You don't really need to be afraid he's going to hurt a family member. He just wants to scare you, which is not very convincing. I think if you were a shop owner, we would recommend stay home, hire security. Yes, keep your family safe. So that's one teretz of the Rashba. And then on the Rashba says, well, if every dayan would be afraid of every threat, then leis din v'leis dayan, there would be no justice. Tshuvas Maharashdam Choshe Mishpat Siman Shin Ayin Ches says, according to the second Maharach in the Rashba, even if it's a very substantial sakana, the dayan cannot afford not to do justice. And the Bach in Siman Yud Beis argues, we only have 3 aveiros that are Yehereg Val Yaver. Tzedek, Tzedek, Tirdot is not one of them. Is this a new Yehereg Val Yaver? In my opinion, it is very poshut. If there really is a threat, a high-level threat, then the Beis Din is responsible to supply security. But yes, we do expect a dayan, a shofet, to take this threat upon himself. If you can't, look for another job. And if there is no high-level risk, so al pi halacha, we would need to turn to the FBI, to the police, to the Shin Bet, to assess, to evaluate, is there a real danger or not? But we do expect a dayan, bearing in mind how important this service is. We cannot afford dayanim and shoftim that will be afraid of every situation and every threat. This is a service. And we do expect dayanim more than others. Loi saguru mipnei ish. And in my opinion, it goes beyond dayanim. It includes doctors. This is the profession you chose. Sometimes you might be at a slightly higher risk than others. During this corona pandemic, at least in Israel, I know, medical staff, some of them were infected. Some of them paid the ultimate price. I don't have the exact statistics, but yes, doctors were in the front line battling this terrible disease, especially in the first stages when there was not really enough Chalifot Magen, protective gear. There wasn't really full awareness of how contagious this disease is. But we do expect this of doctors and nurses. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu will give them sechar. But this is one of the examples of some members of society from whom we expect to put themselves in a higher level of risk than others. If you follow the rules and use all the protective equipment, you should not be in real substantial danger. But yes, I still will recommend for young people to choose medicine as a profession. Because, as I said in my opening remarks, besides teaching Torah, I could see no greater duty to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu and to serve his people. I was asked to discuss triage, Dinei Kedima, in vaccination. Israel leads the world in the number of people relative to the population that are vaccinated. And this is a question I was asked even before we started vaccinating. So it is once in Shas that we find Dinei Kedima, and that's in the Mishnah in Hodias Daf Yud Gimel. Man before a woman, Kohen before a Levi. But I did address these questions in my Chuvas. So if first responders come to a terrible car accident or a terror attack, and there are numerous people that need immediate attention, are they supposed to use the megaphone and ask, if anybody is a Kohen, please lift your hand. Who is a Levi? And check who are the men and the women. I don't think that'll be accepted in the modern world in a very friendly manner. Well, we have halacha, and halacha reigns supreme. Not the way the modern world would address these questions. But I think this halacha is not relevant to our question. It is when you're allocating funds and you must have some system of priority. So the one that has more mitzvahs comes first. But when we're dealing with medical emergencies, whether it's people that are injured in an accident, in a terror attack, or people that are ill, or when we want to prevent people from falling ill, the Seder Kedima is a purely medical one. So many times we would like to stress the difference between the non-Jewish world and the Halachic world relating to Pikuach Nefesh. But let me say that in the vast majority of Shilas, there really would be no major difference. And what Halacha would dictate usually is in correlation and coincides with what basic decency would dictate. So in the tshuva that I wrote, and once again, look it up in Minchas Osher on COVID-19. Don't look for it in the stores yet. Please be patient another 2 or 3 weeks. But there is a halacha which I wrote to the rabbi of Cedar Sinai, one of the major hospitals in Los Angeles, regarding triage kadima in vaccinating. Number one on the list should be medical staff, people who care for others. And if they fall ill, we will have a shortage of doctors and nurses, which we already have in many hospitals in Israel. And the medical teams are really totally exhausted. So these people, their life is in somewhat a higher risk, that it is not only their lives, but the lives of many others that are dependent on them. So after having medical staff vaccinated, then we would try to vaccinate the elderly, the feeble, the ill, and basically the same Seder Kedima, the same list of priorities that we dealt with at the beginning of this pandemic regarding respirators. So I wrote extensively about these topics. Now, one of the relevant questions is, first you need to care for yourself. So why should I be last in line and put others before me? If Rabbi Kiva ben Yosef, the greatest Tana, was the one that dictated, the answer is very simple. If you're dealing with your water, with yours, not with his. Dictates that if my water is not enough for myself, I come before my friend. But I cannot take away his water to save myself. So yes, these vaccines are not yours. They were designated for the broader public. So you have no right to put yourself before others. It doesn't depend on Toras HaKinyonim. There's no difference between vaccines or respirators that were designated for public service than the Kiton Shel Mayim that is Biyad Chaveroi. It is the same. And therefore, yes, we should follow the rules. Another fascinating tshuva in Minchas Osher on Corona is a broad and general discussion of the interaction and the interdependence between halacha and science. Many times we feel, and some people try to say, how halacha and science fight each other. They're not foes. They're more of friends, and they must interact. And in the tshuva I wrote, I explained, it is not only in the medical field in which we consult doctors and scientists. It is not only in Tofreish Yud Ches and Hilchas Yom Kippurim and in Shin Lamed Aleph, Chof Ches and Chof Tes in Hilchas Shabbos that we consult doctors when we need to decide about Chilul Shabbos and violating the rules of fasting and Yom Kippur. I brought 10 different sources and different sugyas, starting off with Kil'ei Zeron in Shabbos Pehei. The Gemara asked, how would Chazal know how far is the Yanikov each species to dictate the halachas of Kalayim. B'nei seir achoyri yoshvei ha'oretz, oto kuli almi yoshvei rekiyahen. What does the pasuk mean, yoshvei ha'oretz? B'nei seir. They knew the science of agriculture, and Chachamim consulted them and relied on their knowledge and expertise. We find this in Hilchas Nida. We find this in Hilchas Reitzeach. When Beis Din needs to decree and pass verdict and din and nefashos and capital punishment, how do we define who was a treifa and who was not? The Rambam in Perik Beis of Hilchas Reitzeach says we consult doctors and we rely on their professionalism to decide in din and nefashos. It is in many different areas of halacha. Yes. I think Rabbonim should be knowledgeable. They should be intelligent to understand what they read, what they hear. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu does not expect Rabbonim to be scientists. No. We must understand the subject matter, but we rely on medical professions, on scientists, on relevant and current information. And one of the principles I've been arguing in the past year is halacha follows mainstream medicine. We have very clear halachas. When there's a machlekes between doctors, how do we decide? Tov Reish Yud Ches, Mishnah Berurah Sif Kot Yud, and it's a Sif in Shulchan Aruch. We rely on the majority of doctors and on the expertise of more senior doctors. So yes, we should follow mainstream medicine, Rav Minyan and Rav Binyan. And if that is what we do, even they might be wrong, sometimes it might happen, but then we have the halachic principle of Shomer B'Soim Hashem. Osinu Mashet Tzivisonu. This is what halacha dictates. And from there and beyond, it is Shomer B'Soim Hashem. I don't think there's any need for me to say this, but I strongly recommend and plea and beg with everyone to vaccinate. To my terrible dismay and sorrow, the Frum community in Israel, the number of people that were vaccinated is far lower than in the non-Frum community. And to me, this is a huge disappointment. We are losing people every day. Many, many have died. A third of all the deaths in Israel. In the past year, we lost 5,000 people to COVID. A third were in the last month, in January. And still, so many people aren't vaccinating. We lost Gedolim, we lost the old, we lost young, we lost men, we lost women. And in this way, many young people are critically ill. In America, the situation seems to be better. But this COVID vaccine, this COVID virus is so unpredictable. In one day, it might just turn around. So it has been my opinion all along. We need to follow the rules, social distancing and wearing masks, and definitely vaccinating. We need to follow, as we always did from the days of Chazal throughout thousands of years. Yes, there always was a positive interaction between halacha and science, and halacha respected and followed mainstream scientific opinions in many different areas, but primarily when dealing with pikuach nefesh. Just in the past week, we lost several gedolim. Yes, they were old, they were feeble, they were ill, but if not for Corona, they might have been with us. The Brisker Rosh Yeshiva of David Soloveitchik, the Kamenetz of the Shiva Rav Shiner, One of the Choshev Rabbonim in Bnei Brak was the son of the Shevet HaLevi, Reb Chaim Vosner, and many others. My mother, Kodesh Baruch Hu, should watch over her Ad Bias HaGoel. My mother is 92. She had a stroke a few months ago. Very feeble. And to our horror, she contracted COVID about a month ago. We tried to give her the best care, and Baruch Hashem, she's past COVID. She still is very weak. She needs a refuah. And if any of you could throw in a few kapitlach tilim for her, it would be very much appreciated. Fadl Basleya. But Baruch Hashem, she's out of this disease. And the doctors that treated her feel that her life was saved by the vaccination. She contracted the disease a few days before her second shot. We weren't aware that she was infected. And we thank you, Kodesh Baruch Hu. It is all up to Hashem. We feel that. We see that every moment. But B'derech HaTeva, the doctors feel her life was saved due to the vaccine. So, yes. And then once again, my bracha to all your young students in the 5 different medical schools, there's thousands of young students. Keep up this amazing endeavor of learning medicine combined with halacha, with Yiddishkeit, the Jewish approach to medicine. The approach which recognizes the interaction between body and soul, guf and neshama. We need to care for the spiritual needs, the psychological needs, the emotional needs of our patients as we care for their medical needs. And I know that that is the spirit in the many different schools and programs of Torah College. Lechu bekochachem zeh v'hoishatem es Yisrael. A bracha to all of you, and thank you once again to the leadership of Torah having me on board and giving me this opportunity. Thank you. You should all be gebenched with good health, arichas yomim v'shonim, and we should all together be able for many more wonderful years to come. Lekadesh Shem Shomayim. Thank you.
So I want to thank Rav Osher Weiss for his tremendous Divrei Torah, for his kind words, and most of all, for his leadership of Klal Yisrael through this difficult time. We have time for a couple of quick questions. So one question that was asked about treatments for COVID is that some of them have only a little bit of effectiveness, a little bit of efficacy, and some significant side effects. So as a general rule in halacha, how do we balance therapies in terms of harm and benefit? Are there any principles the Rav can share that will quickly help elucidate this issue?
I could only share general principles. The details, the psak is always in the details. But let me say this, which some people aren't aware of. There is autonomy given to the patient. And in many cases, the patient has the right to decide al pi halacha. Do I want to take the risk to have a chance to reap the benefit? Shalas Shuvas Yankov, more than 300 years ago, Rabbi Yankov Reisha was one of the great poskim of that era. Chayla Gimel Seminayin Hay deals with a question which is very common today, but it's just amazing to be aware that it was relevant 350 years ago. A person is terminally ill and doctors say, we could offer treatment. It might chas v'sholem bring about his immediate demise. It might give him a cure. And the Sus Yankov's paskim, it is for him to decide. And whatever he decides is halachically acceptable, is halachically justified. And the same goes to many other different dilemmas. When we need to balance substantial side effects against the possible benefit, we're not sure how effective the treatment will be. And there might be substantial side effects, I think, the patient, and if he's not in the capacity to decide, it is his close family members that should decide. Generally, pikuach nefesh overrides every other consideration. But I understand that the question just presented to me is not necessarily pikuach nefesh, but treating a patient. The benefit is not clear, nor are the possible side effects. I think in cases like this, it is for the patient and the family to decide.
So next question. The Rav has been a strong proponent of vaccination, and two related questions to this following up on what the Rav just said. One is, would you recommend that mostos require vaccination before Talmidim come back? And related to that, someone is concerned that there have been some side effects of vaccination. Would you believe that in this case also there's patient autonomy and a patient and a person may decide whether to be vaccinated or not?
Regarding the triple vaccination for children, for measles, mumps, I came out very strongly a few years ago, and I said, moisters do have the right to say, we will not accept children that are not vaccinated. I did not say the same regarding the COVID vaccination, even though I very strongly feel that people should vaccinate. And I cannot say this in more definitive terms. I hope we will not need to decide should moisters close their doors to kids that are unvaccinated. For the time being, we're not vaccinating children, not even in Israel. We're vaccinating adults. Even in Israel, we lowered the bar to 16 years and up. I don't think children were in the trials of Pfizer or Moderna, so we don't really know how children will react to vaccination. So let me just say, people should vaccinate. I want to try to avoid the question, is it a chiyuv? You know, if a person prefers stay behind his mask, lock himself in his house, he's not putting anyone else at a risk or his family or himself at risk. I can't say he's mechuyev to take the vaccine. But most people can't live like that. And most people will expose themselves to others, to their children, to their kids that goes to yeshiva. They expose and will be exposed, and they need to vaccinate. I don't think I could say this in stronger terms. So as far as I understand the material I read and the information I get from mumchim that I consult, well, let's just deal with the numbers. 700,000 people in Israel were infected with corona. 5,000 died. 3.3 million people were vaccinated. We're not aware of one person that died as a result of the vaccination. Yes, some people died within a day of being vaccinated. But if 3 million people go to the mikveh, some of them will die on the day they went to the mikveh. And if 3 million people will eat chont, some of them will die on the day that they ate chont. But we're not aware of the vaccination bringing about the demise of a person. And that is out of 3.3 million that got the vaccination, 700,000 people got COVID, more than 5,000 died. So the numbers speak for themselves. So I know that one could argue, one can analyze, but COVID has been with us for a year. The vaccine has been with us for a very short period. But the extreme side effects are usually the immediate ones after vaccination, not the long-term ones. We have reason to believe that there will be no severe side effects long-term. We will only know in a year or 2 or 3 or 4, but we have all the reasons to believe there will not be any severe side effects. So I apologize for talking like a scientist right now. I'm a Rav, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist, but I must say this because if this conversation will save one Yid, Yehi Zeschori, Kol HaMakayim Nefesh Achas Miyisrael Ki'ilu Kiyem Olam Mole.